On a warm September morning in 1974, a young father and his 5-year-old son walked into the Copper General Store in rural Oregon. Richard Cowden purchased a carton of milk and left the store on foot with little David, heading back to their family campsite along Carberry Creek in the Siskiyou Mountains. It was 9 a.m. on Sunday, September 1st, Labor Day weekend. Back at the campsite, Richard's wife Belinda, just 22 years old, was caring for their 5-month-old daughter, Melissa, while their basset hound, Droopy, lounged nearby. The family had made this camping trip a last-minute decision after Richard's truck broke down, preventing him from working on their driveway as he'd planned. Instead, they chose to spend the holiday weekend in nature, at a place they'd visited many times before. It should have been a perfect Labor Day weekend. Instead, it became one of the most haunting and baffling mysteries in Oregon history. By that evening, the Cowden family would vanish without a trace from their campsite, leaving behind only an eerie tableau of abandoned belongings that would chill investigators to the bone. 7 months later, their bodies would be discovered in a remote location that suggested something far more sinister than a simple camping accident. And at the center of the investigation would be a recently paroled convicted murderer whose dark past and suspicious behavior would make him the prime suspect in a case that remains officially unsolved to this day. This is the story of the Cowden family murders, a case that spawned one of the largest search operations in Oregon history, haunted the detectives who worked it for the rest of their lives, and left a community forever changed. It's a story that asks troubling questions about justice, parole systems, and whether evil can truly be rehabilitated. And it's a mystery that, after 50 years, still has no official resolution. To understand what happened to the Cowdens, we need to understand who they were. Richard Cowden was born on October 9, 1946, and by 1974, at age 27, he was working as a logging truck driver in White City, Oregon, a small community in Jackson County. He had married Belinda June, born May 24, 1952, when she was still quite young. At just 22 years old, Belinda was already the mother of 2 children. David James Phillips, Belinda's son from a previous relationship, was born June 30, 1969, making him 5 years old that fateful summer. Baby Melissa Dawn Cowden, born March 19, 1974, was only 5 months old, still an infant completely dependent on her parents. The Cowdens were an outdoorsy family who loved camping and frequently visited the mountains of southern Oregon. They knew the area around Carberry Creek well. It was familiar territory, which made what would happen there all the more shocking. Labor Day weekend 1974 began with different plans. Richard had intended to spend the weekend hauling gravel to work on their driveway at home. It was going to be a productive, if unexciting, use of the holiday. But fate intervened when the truck Richard planned to use for the gravel hauling broke down. Rather than spend the weekend frustrated at home, the young couple made a spontaneous decision. They would pack up the kids and their beloved basset hound and head to the mountains for a camping trip. On Friday, August 30th, 1974, the Cowden family loaded up their 1956 Ford pickup truck and drove to the Siskiyou Mountains near Copper, Oregon. Copper was a small town in Jackson County, about 25 miles southwest of Medford. The family headed to a campground near Carberry Creek, a stream that empties into what would later become Applegate Lake. This was familiar ground for them. They had camped in this area before and knew it well. They set up their campsite in the Rogue River National Forest, parking their pickup truck on Carberry Creek Road, a short distance from where they pitched their tent. The weather was beautiful. The creek provided cool water for swimming. Everything seemed perfect. Saturday, August 31st, passed uneventfully. The family spent time at their campsite, enjoying the outdoors. Perhaps they swam in the creek, cooked meals over their camp stove, and watched as baby Melissa took in all the new sights and sounds of the wilderness. 5-year-old David likely explored the area with the enthusiasm only a young child can muster, with Droopy the dog never far behind. Then came Sunday, September 1st, 1974, the day everything changed. According to the timeline established by investigators, Richard Cowden and his son David arrived at the Copper General Store at approximately 9 a.m. that Sunday morning. They had walked there from the campsite on foot. Richard purchased milk, a simple, mundane transaction that would later become heartbreakingly significant. The store owner and other witnesses saw father and son leave the store together, heading back toward their campsite on foot. This was the last confirmed sighting of any member of the Cowden family alive. What happened next can only be pieced together from the evidence left behind. Investigators believe that after Richard and David returned to the campsite with the milk, the family went swimming in Carberry Creek. Their bathing suits were missing from the truck, the only clothing unaccounted for. It suggests a normal, happy family enjoying a summer morning swim. But sometime before noon that day, something terrible occurred. The Cowden family was abducted from their campsite, probably at gunpoint, and most likely by someone they did not know, according to Lieutenant Mark Kazar, who headed the investigation. That evening, Belinda's mother was expecting the family to come to her home for dinner on their way back to White City. She lived less than 1 mile from the campground, and the plan had been for the Cowdens to stop by before heading home. When dinner time came and went with no sign of her daughter, son-in-law, and grandchildren, Belinda's mother grew concerned. She decided to drive to the campsite to check on them. What she found when she arrived sent chills through her entire body. The campsite was empty, completely devoid of human life. But everything else was still there, arranged as if the family had simply stepped away for a moment and would return at any second. The family's 1956 Ford pickup truck sat parked on the road, its keys lying in plain sight on a picnic table. Belinda's purse sat on the table, untouched. On the ground nearby lay Richard's wallet, which still contained $21, equivalent to about $134 in today's money. His expensive wristwatch was also on the ground. A plastic dishpan full of cold water sat nearby. The camp stove was fully assembled and set up. On the picnic table sat the carton of milk Richard had purchased that morning at the general store, half full and still cold. An open pack of cigarettes lay on the table, the brand Belinda was known to smoke. A diaper bag for baby Melissa sat in plain view, ready for use. The family's clothing remained in the truck. Only their bathing suits were missing. Most haunting of all was the family's basset hound, Droopy. The following morning, September 2nd, Droopy was found alone and distressed, scratching desperately at the door of the Copper General Store, as if trying to communicate that something terrible had happened to his family. Belinda's mother immediately contacted police. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office, Oregon State Police, and local troopers responded to the scene. When they arrived and surveyed the campsite, even hardened law enforcement officers felt an unmistakable sense of dread. Oregon State Trooper Erickson would later recall, "That camp was spooky. Even the milk was still on the table." Lieutenant Mark Kazar, who would head the case, later admitted that the investigation had been delayed for maybe a day because initially, there was no clear indication that anything violent had occurred at the campsite. In 1974, the protocol at many police agencies was to wait 24 hours before treating someone as a missing person. It was a policy that, in this case, may have cost precious time. "I believe that policy has changed. I would hope so," retired Oregon State Police Detective Richard Davis said decades later. But by September 2nd, it was clear this was no ordinary missing persons case. The Cowden family had not simply wandered off into the woods. They had been taken. What followed was one of the largest search operations in Oregon history. The scale and intensity of the effort reflected both the mysterious nature of the disappearance and the fear it generated throughout the region. If a family of 4 could vanish in broad daylight from a populated campground, leaving everything behind, then no one was safe. The search investigation included assistance from state and local police, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, the Oregon State Police, numerous civilian volunteers, Explorer Scouts, the United States Forest Service, and even the Oregon National Guard. It was a massive, coordinated effort spanning multiple agencies and involving hundreds of people. The U.S. Forest Service alone searched 25 miles of roads and trails surrounding the campsite. Helicopters and planes flew over the area equipped with infrared photography technology that could detect recently overturned dirt or disturbed earth, signs that might indicate where bodies had been buried or hidden. Search dogs were brought in to try to pick up the family's scent. Volunteers combed through dense forest undergrowth, calling out the names of the missing family members, hoping against hope for a response. The Oregon State Police and Jackson County Police conducted interviews with over 150 individuals in their early investigation. They talked to everyone who had been camping in the area that weekend, store owners, locals who lived nearby, and anyone who might have seen or heard anything unusual. A $2,000 reward, equivalent to approximately $12,752 in today's money, was offered in exchange for information regarding the family's disappearance. Richard Cowden's sister wrote a letter to the Medford Mail Tribune, desperately pleading that hunters be alert to anything that doesn't look right as the hunting season approached. She hoped that perhaps someone venturing into remote areas might stumble across evidence of what had happened to her brother and his family. Despite the massive search efforts and the dedication of hundreds of people, law enforcement was unable to find any evidence of a crime. There were no bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle, no physical evidence of what had happened to the Cowden family. It was as if they had been erased from existence. As weeks turned into months, hope began to fade. The camping season ended, fall arrived, and then winter blanketed the Siskiyou Mountains in snow. The search was eventually suspended, though it was never officially closed. The Cowden family was gone, and no one knew where or why. Then came April 12, 1975, 7 months after the family's disappearance. Two men were prospecting for gold near Carberry Creek, approximately 7 miles from where the Cowdens had camped. They were exploring a remote, heavily wooded area that few people ever visited. That's when one of them made a horrifying discovery: skeletal remains. They immediately contacted authorities. When law enforcement arrived at the scene and began their investigation, they discovered something even more disturbing than a single body. The scene was macabre and deliberately staged in a way that suggested the killer or killers had gone to great lengths to conceal what they had done. Richard Cowden's skull and skeletal remains were found on a steep hillside, tied to a tree with a leather strap. His body had been left exposed to the elements for 7 months, and scavenging animals had scattered some of the remains. About 100 feet away, investigators discovered a small cave. The entrance to the cave had been carefully sealed with rocks, deliberately concealing what lay inside. When they moved the rocks aside and looked into the cave, investigators found the skeletal remains of 3 more people: a woman and 2 children, one of them an infant. The bodies had been placed inside the cave together, and then the entrance had been sealed to hide them from view and to slow decomposition. Dental records confirmed what investigators already suspected. These were the remains of Belinda Cowden, 5-year-old David, and 5-month-old baby Melissa. The entire Cowden family had been murdered. The autopsy results revealed the horrifying manner of their deaths. Belinda had been shot to death. 5-year-old David had also died from gunshot wounds. Baby Melissa, just 5 months old, had died from blunt force trauma to the head. The tiny infant had been beaten to death. As for Richard Cowden, despite extensive examination of his remains, the medical examiner could not determine a definitive cause of death. Dr. William Brady, the state medical examiner, stated, "It's a presumed homicide. I'm sure he was shot, even though we can't prove it." The skeletal condition of the remains and the passage of time made it impossible to determine exactly how he had died, though gunshot was suspected. The location where the bodies were found was significant. It was approximately 7 miles from the family's campsite, a considerable distance through rough, forested terrain. The killer or killers had transported the entire family, including a 5-month-old infant, 7 miles through the wilderness to this remote location. The steep hillside and hidden cave suggested the perpetrator knew the area well and had deliberately chosen this spot because it was unlikely to be discovered. Interestingly, one of the volunteers who had searched for the Cowden family in September 1974 told authorities something that would haunt investigators. He had been to that exact location during the initial search and had checked the small cave. At that time, he said, the cave was empty. If his recollection was accurate, it meant the bodies had been moved to that location sometime after the initial search had concluded. Perhaps the killer had hidden them elsewhere first, then relocated them once the search died down. Or perhaps the volunteer simply missed them in the sealed cave. Either way, it added another layer of mystery to an already baffling case. Investigators collected everything they could from the crime scene. Due to the 7 months that had passed and exposure to the elements, much potential evidence had been destroyed. However, they did find one crucial piece of evidence: a single bullet that belonged to a Marlin-manufactured rifle. It was physical proof that the family had been shot, and it gave investigators something concrete to work with, a specific type of weapon to search for. We're looking for anybody that had purchased that weapon that could have fired that shot. A weapon that could have fired that shot, Detective Richard Davis would later say. But the murder weapon itself was never found. The possibility of murder-suicide was briefly explored and quickly dismissed. Richard Cowden's wallet and money had been left behind at the campsite, suggesting he had not been the one who moved the family's bodies. More importantly, no weapon had been found at the scene where the bodies were discovered. If Richard had killed his family and then himself, the gun would have been there with the bodies. It wasn't. This was a homicide, multiple homicides, a family massacre, and the killer was still out there. As investigators worked the case, one name kept coming up: Dwayne Lee Little. Dwayne Lee Little was born around 1951 in Oregon. By the time he was a teenager, he had already demonstrated a capacity for extreme violence that marked him as dangerous. On November 2, 1964, when Little was just 15 years old, he committed an act that would define the rest of his life and the lives of everyone he would encounter. He raped and murdered 16-year-old Orla Faye Phipps in Springfield, Oregon. The details of Orla Faye Phipps' murder were brutal. Little had sexually assaulted the teenage girl and then stabbed her to death. At just 15 years old, Little was tried, convicted, and sentenced for first-degree murder. He was sent to the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, one of the youngest inmates in the facility. Little served 8 years for the rape and murder of Orla Faye Phipps. 8 years for taking a 16-year-old girl's life in the most violent way imaginable. On May 24, 1974, exactly 3 months before the Cowden family disappeared, Dwayne Lee Little was paroled from the Oregon State Penitentiary. He was released back into society at age 23, a convicted rapist and murderer who had spent his formative years behind bars. After his release, Little relocated to Rouge, Oregon, a rural community near the Cowden family's campsite along Carberry Creek in the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest. Rouge was a small, isolated town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and a newcomer, especially a recently paroled murderer, would be noticed. When the Cowden family disappeared on September 1, 1974, state police began investigating everyone who had been in the area that Labor Day weekend. What they discovered about Dwayne Lee Little immediately elevated him to the status of prime suspect. State police were able to determine that Little had been in Copper over the Labor Day weekend at the approximate time the Cowden family disappeared. This placed him at the scene or very near it at the critical time. But there was more. Eyewitnesses reported seeing Little purchasing gas at a station near the location of the Cowden family's campsite. The owner of the Copper General Store, the same store where Richard Cowden bought milk that fateful morning, remembered seeing Little in the area. Police also believed they had identified Little at the crime scene itself, though the evidence was circumstantial. A family from Los Angeles who had been camping nearby told investigators about an encounter that had made them uncomfortable. They reported seeing 2 men and a woman in a truck at the campground who seemed out of place and whose behavior struck them as suspicious. They provided descriptions of the individuals and the vehicle, a truck with particular identifying characteristics. Police believed that the 2 men and woman in the truck were, in fact, Dwayne Lee Little and his parents. The vehicle matched the description provided by the Los Angeles family. Little's parents owned a truck consistent with what the witnesses described. Little and his parents denied any knowledge of the Cowdens' disappearances when questioned by police. They insisted they hadn't been in the area, hadn't seen anything, and knew nothing about the missing family. But then investigators discovered something that contradicted their denials. A miner who owned a cabin in the area near Carberry Creek kept a guest book for visitors. a common practice in remote areas where people might need to document their presence for safety reasons or simply as a friendly record of who passed through. The miner told police that on Monday, September 2nd, 1974, the day after the Cowdens disappeared, Dwayne Lee Little and his parents had stopped by his cabin and signed his guest book. This placed them in the area the day after the family vanished, despite their claims to the contrary. The evidence continued to mount. Investigators theorized, based on Little's known movements, that he had hauled a load of steel to Crescent City, California, the day before the Cowdens disappeared. Coming back from Crescent City on Highway 199, he would have passed very near the Cowden family's campsite. Since it was now a holiday weekend, it was entirely plausible that he had decided to stop in the area. But having a suspect in the area was one thing. Connecting him directly to the murders was another. Then, in late 1974, Little's girlfriend came forward with information that would lead to his parole being revoked. Little's girlfriend told law enforcement that she had seen him with a .22 caliber gun during the Christmas season of 1974. This was significant for two reasons. First, as a convicted felon on parole, Little was prohibited from possessing any firearms. Second, a .22 caliber weapon was consistent with the type of rifle that would have fired the bullet found at the crime scene, the bullet from the Marlowe-manufactured rifle. On January 12, 1975, Dwayne Lee Little's parole was revoked after his girlfriend informed police of his possession of a firearm. He was sent back to the Oregon State Penitentiary for violating the terms of his parole. Detective Richard Davis, who was one of the lead investigators on the Cowden case, saw Little's return to custody as an opportunity. Davis went to the prison to interview Little about the Cowden murders. During that interview, Davis made Little an offer: take a polygraph examination about the Cowden family murders, and in exchange, Davis would dismiss the gun possession charge that had sent Little back to prison. It seemed like a good deal for Little. The polygraph results wouldn't be admissible in court, so even if he failed, it couldn't be used to convict him. And in exchange, he would be released from prison. All he had to do was take the test and presumably tell the truth. I told him, you take a polygraph, and I had a polygraph examiner standing by, and you take a polygraph on account of the murdered Cowden family, although the polygraph I can't use in court. You take the polygraph, I'll dismiss this gun case, Davis recalled. Little's response was immediate and definitive. No. That single word, no, brought the investigation right back to square one. If Little had nothing to hide, why wouldn't he take a polygraph examination that couldn't even be used against him in court? His refusal only deepened suspicions. Little remained in prison until he was paroled again on April 26, 1977. Once again, a convicted rapist and murderer was released back into society, despite being the prime suspect in the murders of an entire family, including 2 children. For 3 years after his second parole, Dwayne Lee Little lived freely in Oregon. Then, on June 2, 1980, he committed another horrific crime that would finally put him behind bars for life. A 23-year-old pregnant woman named Margie Hunter was driving on Oregon Route 99 West in the Portland area when her car broke down. She was stranded on the side of the road, vulnerable and in need of help. She started hitchhiking, hoping someone would give her a ride to safety. Dwayne Lee Little picked her up. But instead of helping her, he sexually assaulted and beat the pregnant young woman. The attack was vicious and prolonged. Margie Hunter fought for her life and the life of her unborn child. Miraculously, she survived. When Margie Hunter escaped and reported the assault, police arrested Dwayne Lee Little. This time, there would be no possibility of parole. Little was charged with and convicted of attempted murder, sexual assault, and other related charges. On November 20, 1980, he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in prison. But even from behind bars, the question of Little's involvement in the Cowden murders continued to haunt investigators and the Oregon criminal justice system. Over the years, several inmates who served time with Little came forward with disturbing claims. One of the most significant was Rusty Kelly, an inmate who at one time shared a cell with Dwayne Lee Little. Kelly later told investigators that Little had confessed to him about the Cowden murders. According to Kelly, Little admitted to killing the entire family. Jailhouse confessions are notoriously unreliable. Inmates sometimes fabricate stories for various reasons, including seeking reduced sentences or attention. But Kelly's account was taken seriously because of how it aligned with other evidence in the case. Years later, Detective Richard Davis, who had never given up on the Cowden case even after retiring in 1992, decided to try one more time to get answers. He reached out to another convicted murderer, Russell Loren Abramsky, who had been incarcerated with Little. Davis and Abramsky danced around the topic at first, as Davis later described it, before Davis went straight to the point and asked about Little's involvement in the Cowden murders. Abramsky's response was chilling. "You're wasting your time. Dwayne Little is going to say nothing to anybody. Never. He don't say nothing to nobody." It was a dead end. Little had apparently made it clear to other inmates that he would never discuss the Cowden case, would never confess, would never provide closure to the family or to the investigators who had spent years trying to solve the case. Detective Richard Davis was haunted by the Cowden murders for the rest of his life. In a 2020 interview, when he was 81 years old and one of the last surviving detectives who had investigated the case, Davis shared details he had never disclosed before to the public. When an investigator solves a murder case and arrests a suspect, it's generally forgotten within a week. "You don't pay attention to it, it's over," Davis said. "The ones you do not solve, you never forget." The Cowden case, he admitted, was his greatest professional failure. "These were good, solid citizens. And they disappeared," he said, his voice heavy with regret even decades later. Davis described how the investigation had been mishandled in the crucial first 24 hours, how the delay in treating the disappearance as a serious crime potentially allowed critical evidence to be lost or destroyed. He talked about the months spent chasing their tails, pursuing leads that went nowhere, interviewing witness after witness, and always coming back to Dwayne Lee Little, but never being able to definitively prove his guilt. During the actual search and recovery for bones and stuff, the men became kind of giddy, Davis recalled, describing the moment when they finally found the bodies. But once we got back into the vehicles, it became very somber. Reality sets in. My God, what have I been doing? How could I have been giddy up there on the hillside when this family's been murdered, brutally murdered? The discovery of the bodies, rather than bringing closure, only deepened the sense of failure. They had found the Cowdens, but they were 7 months too late. And despite knowing who likely killed them, they couldn't prove it. In a moment of painful honesty, Davis said, "I'm sorry it opens old wounds. I am ashamed. I am sorry. The Cowden family did not get justice, and I was a part of their not getting justice, and it haunts me." Davis also revealed that the failures of the Cowden investigation inspired him to create something positive from tragedy. In the 1980s, he founded the Major Crime Death Investigation Unit, a multi-agency homicide investigation team that serves Jackson County to this day. It was designed to prevent the kind of coordination problems and delays that had hampered the Cowden investigation. "Doing this, failing as miserably as we failed, made me a better officer," Davis said. But becoming a better officer didn't erase the pain of knowing that the Cowden family never received justice. Despite the voluminous circumstantial evidence against him, as prosecutors described it, Dwayne Lee Little was never charged with the murders of the Cowden family. The circumstantial evidence, his presence in the area, the timeline, his refusal to take a polygraph, the jailhouse confession, was not enough to bring charges that would hold up in court. Without physical evidence directly linking Little to the crime scene, without the murder weapon, without eyewitnesses who could place him at the campsite at the exact time of the abduction, prosecutors felt they couldn't secure a conviction. And so the case remains officially unsolved. The murders of the Cowden family sent shockwaves through Oregon and particularly through the small communities of Jackson County. The case received nationwide attention, with coverage in major newspapers including the New York Post. It was featured on the television show Unsolved Mysteries and has been the subject of numerous true crime books, including a chapter in Crime Writer and Rule's 2009 book, But I Trusted You. The public provided thousands of tips over the years. There were reported sightings of the Cowden family in San Francisco and Seattle, which turned out to be false reports. People who vaguely resembled the missing family, or wishful thinking by those who hoped they were still alive. Every lead was investigated and ultimately led nowhere. For the surviving family members, the pain has never diminished. A commenter on a 2019 article about the case identified herself as Richard Cowden's niece. She wrote, "This was my Uncle Richard and his family. We still do not have closure. It will be 50 years since their bodies were discovered, April 12, 1975. Not a day goes by I don't think about how horrific this crime was. My Uncle Richard has one sister living. I would like to have the case re-examined." The sister she mentioned, Richard Cowden's only surviving sibling, has lived for half a century without answers. She buried her brother, his young wife, and 2 small children without ever knowing for certain who killed them or why. The loss of the children, especially 5-month-old Melissa, who barely had a chance to live, is almost incomprehensible in its cruelty. The impact on the community was profound and lasting. The Applegate Valley, where the murders occurred, lost its sense of innocence. Catherine Smith, a mail carrier who was born in the Applegate Valley and worked there since 1976, told reporters in 1990, "We don't go anywhere without our loaded weapons, our pistols. I just don't trust nobody. You just keep your eyes open." The killings of the White City family served as a chilling lesson. Evil could strike anywhere, even in the seeming safety of a family campground on a beautiful September morning. The town of Copper itself no longer exists. In 1976, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began construction on the Applegate Dam as part of a flood control project authorized by Congress in 1962. The dam was finished in 1980 at a final cost of $96 million. When Applegate Lake was created, the town of Copper was flooded and disappeared beneath the water. The campground where the Cowdens spent their last hours is now somewhere under the 988-acre reservoir. In a way, the lake serves as both a memorial and a grave marker for the Cowden family. The exact spot where they were last seen alive now lies beneath hundreds of feet of water, forever hidden from view. It's a metaphor for the case itself, the truth buried, concealed, impossible to reach. Carberry Creek, named after Jim Carberry, a businessman in the local mining industry, still empties into Applegate Lake. The remote area where the bodies were found, 7 miles from the campsite, remains largely unchanged. Still heavily forested, still difficult to reach, still a place where few people venture. Over the years, there have been periodic calls to re-examine the case. Advances in forensic technology, particularly DNA analysis, have solved many cold cases from the 1970s. But the Cowden case presents unique challenges. The bodies were exposed to the elements for 7 months before discovery. The skeletal remains offer limited opportunities for DNA collection compared to fresher remains. And the key piece of evidence, the bullet found at the scene, can only tell investigators what kind of rifle fired it, not who pulled the trigger. The murder weapon has never been found. If Dwayne Lee Little did possess a .22 caliber rifle that fired the bullet discovered at the scene, he either disposed of it thoroughly or still has it hidden somewhere. Without the weapon, even modern ballistics analysis can't definitively link the bullet to a specific gun owned by a specific person. To this day, the Oregon State Police maintain that there are no new leads and no new suspects in the Cowden family murders. The case file remains open, but it is, for all practical purposes, cold. Dwayne Lee Little remains incarcerated in the Oregon State Penitentiary, where he has been since 1980. Now in his 70s, having spent the majority of his life behind bars, Little continues to maintain his silence about the Cowden murders. He has never been cooperative with mental health treatment, and he has refused to discuss any of the murders he has been accused of committing. In various interviews over the years, Little has declined to speak about the Cowden case. No comment is all investigators and journalists have received from him. His steadfast refusal to either confess or definitively clear his name has left the case in permanent limbo. The circumstantial evidence against Little is indeed voluminous, as prosecutors once described it. He was convicted of raping and murdering a teenage girl in 1964, establishing a pattern of extreme violence. He was paroled just 3 months before the Cowden family disappeared. He lived in Rouge, very near the campsite. He was in Copper over the Labor Day weekend when the family disappeared. Eyewitnesses placed him purchasing gas near the campsite. He and his parents were identified by witnesses as suspicious individuals at the campground. He signed a guest book at a nearby cabin the day after the family disappeared, despite denying being in the area. His girlfriend reported he possessed a .22 caliber gun, the type of weapon used in the murders. He refused to take a polygraph examination even when offered release from prison in exchange. A cellmate claimed Little confessed to the murders. He attacked and nearly killed another woman in 1980 in a crime eerily similar in its brutality. Yet despite all of this, the standard for criminal prosecution is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And prosecutors never felt they had sufficient direct evidence to meet that standard. Critics of the criminal justice system point to the Cowden case as an example of how the system failed at multiple levels. Little should never have been paroled after just 8 years for raping and murdering Orla Faye Phipps. He was 15 when he committed that crime, but the brutality of it suggested a level of violence that warranted longer incarceration. When he was paroled a second time in 1977, despite being the prime suspect in the Cowden murders, it represented another failure. An inability to protect the public from a known dangerous individual because the evidence, though compelling, wasn't definitive enough to charge him. When Margie Hunter barely survived Little's attack in 1980, it was only then that the system finally kept him locked away permanently. By that point, Little had potentially killed 5 people and seriously injured at least 2 others. How many lives might have been saved if he had never been paroled? How many families might have been spared unbearable grief? These are questions that haunt not just Detective Richard Davis, but everyone involved in the case. Over the decades, various theories have been proposed about what exactly happened to the Cowden family on that September morning in 1974. The most widely accepted theory, based on the evidence and investigative work, goes something like this. After Richard and David returned from the Copper General Store with milk around 9:30 a.m., the family likely went swimming in Carberry Creek. Their missing bathing suits suggest this. While they were swimming or shortly after returning to their campsite, Dwayne Lee Little, possibly accompanied by his parents or another accomplice, arrived at the campsite. Little was armed with a rifle, likely a .22 caliber weapon. He confronted the family at gunpoint. Whether he intended to rob them, assault Belinda, or simply eliminate potential witnesses to some other crime is unknown. The fact that Richard's wallet with $21 was left behind suggests robbery wasn't the primary motive. Little forced the family, Richard, Belinda, 5-year-old David, and 5-month-old baby Melissa, along with their dog Droopy, into a vehicle. This would explain why none of the family's belongings showed signs of struggle. They were taken at gunpoint and had no opportunity to fight back or escape. Little then drove the family approximately 7 miles through the wilderness to the remote location where their bodies would eventually be found. It's possible he had scouted this location beforehand, or perhaps he knew the area from previous visits. The steep hillside and hidden cave made it an ideal place to conceal bodies. What happened next is the most horrific part of the theory. Little shot Richard, Belinda, and 5-year-old David to death. Baby Melissa, only 5 months old, was killed by blunt force trauma to the head, beaten to death. Why he chose this method for the infant is unclear, but it may have been to avoid the noise of additional gunshots, or it may simply have been an act of incomprehensible cruelty. After murdering the entire family, Little placed Belinda's body and the 2 children's bodies inside the small cave and sealed the entrance with rocks. Richard's body was tied to a tree on the hillside with a leather strap. Then Little left, returning to his life as if nothing had happened. The dog, Droopy, somehow escaped or was released during the ordeal and eventually made his way back to the Copper General Store, where he scratched desperately at the door the next morning. Whether Little let the dog go or whether Droopy managed to escape on his own is unknown. The fact that the dog survived while the entire family was murdered adds another layer of tragedy to the story. Droopy was the only witness, and he couldn't tell anyone what he had seen. This theory accounts for all the known evidence: the abandoned campsite with belongings intact, the location of the bodies 7 miles away, the manner of death, the sealed cave, and Little's presence in the area at the critical time. It also explains why Little refused to cooperate with investigators. He knew that any cooperation, even taking a polygraph, might lead to evidence being discovered that could convict him. But this remains just a theory. Alternative theories have been proposed over the years, though none have the same evidentiary support. Some have suggested that a transient drifter, someone passing through the area, happened upon the Cowden family and killed them for reasons unknown. This theory is less compelling because it doesn't explain the meticulous concealment of the bodies or the fact that nothing was stolen from the campsite. Perhaps the family witnessed something they shouldn't have, a drug deal, illegal hunting, or some other criminal activity, and were killed to silence them. This theory has some merit but lacks any supporting evidence. No criminal activity was reported in that area around that time. Could Richard Cowden have been specifically targeted for some reason? Did he have enemies from his work as a truck driver? The investigation found no evidence of this, and it doesn't explain why his wallet and money were left behind. Ultimately, the theory that Dwayne Lee Little killed the Cowden family remains the most plausible explanation based on the available evidence. Story 3. There's something about the late shift at a fast food restaurant that feels both mundane and oddly intimate. The fluorescent lights casting their sterile glow over empty tables. The smell of fryer oil and disinfectant. The quiet moments between customers when time seems to slow down, and you're just waiting for the clock to strike 11 so you can lock the doors, count the register, and finally go home. On the night of November 17th, 1978, four young people were working the closing shift at a Burger Chef restaurant in Speedway, Indiana. They were doing what thousands of teenagers across America were doing that very same night. Wiping down tables, mopping floors, closing out the register, eager to finish their work and move on with their Friday evening. By midnight, they had vanished. The restaurant stood empty, lights still on, back door hanging open. Within 48 hours, all four would be found dead in a wooded field, victims of a crime that remains unsolved to this day, nearly 50 years later. This is the story of the Burger Chef murders, a case that haunted investigators for decades, generated confessions that led nowhere, and left a small Indiana community forever changed. It's a story about four young lives cut short, about the fragility of safety, and about how sometimes the worst things happen in the most ordinary places. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me tell you about a November night in 1978, when four teenagers clocked in for their shift at Burger Chef, not knowing they would never clock out. To understand this story, we first need to understand where it took place. Speedway, Indiana is a small town, really more of a suburb, located on the west side of Indianapolis. If you've heard of Speedway, it's probably because of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, the famous racetrack that hosts the Indianapolis 500 every Memorial Day weekend. In 1978, Speedway had a population of around 13,000 people. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where families had lived for generations, where high school football games were community events. It was safe. It was quiet. It was home. The Burger Chef restaurant sat at 5725 Crawfordsville Road, a busy commercial strip that ran through Speedway. Burger Chef was once one of America's largest fast food chains, rivaling McDonald's in its heyday. Founded in Indianapolis in 1954, Burger Chef grew to over 1,000 locations across the United States by the 1970s. They were known for their flame-broiled burgers, their fun meal for kids, which actually preceded McDonald's Happy Meal, and their distinctive orange and brown uniforms. By 1978, Burger Chef was still a popular spot, though the company was beginning to struggle financially. But to the residents of Speedway, their local Burger Chef was just another fixture of daily life. A place to grab a quick burger, a place for teenagers to work their first jobs, a place as familiar and unremarkable as the post office or the gas station. For young employees were scheduled to work the closing shift on Friday, November 17th, 1978. Let me tell you about each of them, because they deserve to be remembered as more than just victims. Jane Freet was 20 years old, the oldest of the four and the assistant manager of the restaurant. She had graduated from Speedway High School in 1976 and had been working at Burger Chef for several years. working her way up to a management position. Jane was known for her warm personality and her dedication to her job. She was supporting her family financially and took her responsibilities seriously. Friends described her as full of life, always smiling, always making jokes even when she was in a bad mood. She had dreams beyond Burger Chef, but for now, this was her job and she did it well. Her younger sister Teresa, who was 12 at the time, would later say that Jane always came home with funny stories about work. Daniel Davis was 16 years old, a sophomore at Speedway High School. He was a typical teenage boy, played sports, hung out with friends, worked at Burger Chef to earn spending money. Daniel was friendly and well-liked. This was probably just another Friday night shift to him. Nothing special, just a few hours of work before the weekend really began. Mark Flemons was also 16 years old, Daniel's classmate at Speedway High. Mark had dreams beyond working at a fast food restaurant. Don't all teenagers? But for now, this job paid for gas money, dates, the small luxuries that make teenage life a little easier. Mark wasn't even originally scheduled to work that night. He had picked up the shift, probably thinking he could use the extra money. That decision would cost him his life. Ruth Ellen Shelton was 17 years old, a senior at Speedway High School. She was an honors student with her whole future ahead of her. Ruth had taken the job at Burger Chef for the same reasons most teenagers do. Independence, spending money, a sense of responsibility. She had a sense of humor, her sister would later recall. She loved working at Dunkin' Donuts as well as Burger Chef and always came home with amusing stories about her shifts. She was saving up to buy the things all teenage girls wanted: clothes, makeup, records. For ordinary teenagers, for kids just trying to make some money, get through their shifts, and enjoy their weekend. November 17th, 1978, started out like any other Friday for them. The restaurant opened as usual that morning. The day shift came and went. As evening approached, the 4 closing crew members arrived for their shifts. Jane, as the assistant manager, was in charge. Daniel, Mark, and Ruth were there to help close, taking orders, cooking food, cleaning up, preparing the restaurant to shut down for the night. Burger Chef's closing time was 11 p.m. The routine was simple and familiar. Serve the last customers, lock the front doors, clean the restaurant, count the money from the registers, put it in the safe, turn off most of the lights, exit through the back door, and lock it behind you. On a good night, you could be out of there by 11:30, maybe midnight at the latest. But something went wrong that night. Terribly, horribly wrong. A little after midnight, somewhere between 12 o'clock and 12:15 a.m. on November 18th, a 16-year-old boy named Brian Kring drove past the Burger Chef on his way home. Brian worked at the restaurant too, though he wasn't scheduled that night. He knew the closing crew was Jane, Daniel, Mark, and Ruth. Maybe he thought he'd stop by, see if they wanted to hang out after their shift, see if they needed any help closing up. When Brian pulled into the parking lot, something immediately felt off. The lights were still on inside the restaurant. The front doors appeared to be unlocked. But when he walked in, the restaurant was completely empty. Brian called out. No answer. He walked through the dining room, checked the kitchen. Nobody. The 4 employees who were supposed to be there had vanished. But that wasn't all Brian noticed. The back door of the restaurant was hanging open. Not just unlocked, but actually ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry, or had been forced to leave. The safe was open. Some money was missing, though not all of it, and there were signs that the restaurant had been in the process of closing. Cleaning had been done, but not completed. It was as if the 4 employees had been interrupted mid-task and had simply disappeared. Brian's first thought was probably confusion, not panic. Maybe they'd stepped outside for a smoke break? Maybe they were taking out the trash? But the longer he stood there in that empty restaurant with its fluorescent lights humming and its back door swinging open, the more uneasy he felt. He started making phone calls. He called friends, trying to reach Jane, see if anyone had heard from the crew. No one had. Finally, Brian called the Speedway Police Department. It was now approaching 12:30 a.m. The police arrived quickly. Speedway is a small town, after all. But when they surveyed the scene, they didn't immediately treat it as a crisis. For teenage employees, a Friday night, some money missing from the safe? The initial assumption was relatively benign. The kids had stolen some cash and taken off to go party. Irresponsible, yes. Criminal, certainly, but not necessarily dangerous. This initial assessment would prove to be a tragic mistake that would haunt the investigation for decades. The police did their due diligence, but without treating it as an emergency. They contacted the families of the 4 missing employees: Jane's mother, Ruth's mother, Daniel's parents, Mark's family. All received calls in the middle of the night informing them that their children were missing from work. You can imagine the confusion, the worry, the fear that began to creep in. Where were they? What had happened? As Saturday, November 18th, dawned, the reality of the situation began to sink in. These weren't reckless teenagers who'd skipped out on work to go party. These were responsible kids. Jane was the assistant manager, for God's sake. They wouldn't just abandon their jobs. They wouldn't steal money and run. Something was very, very wrong. By Saturday afternoon, the case had been upgraded from petty theft to robbery kidnapping. The Speedway Police Department, the Marion County Sheriff's Department, and the Indiana State Police all became involved. A massive search operation was launched. Where were the 4 missing employees? Were they being held somewhere? Were they hurt? Were they still alive? Sunday, November 19th, 1978, 2 days after the disappearance, brought the answer that everyone had been dreading. 2 men were in a rural area of Johnson County, about 20 miles south of Speedway, when they discovered something that made their blood run cold. In a wooded field, partially hidden in the brush, they found bodies. For bodies, all wearing orange and brown burger chef uniforms. Police were called immediately. When investigators arrived at the scene, they confirmed what the witnesses had found. The 4 missing burger chef employees, Jane Freet, Daniel Davis, Mark Flemons, and Ruth Ellen Shelton, were all dead. The crime scene told a brutal story. The victims had been taken to this remote location, far from the restaurant, far from any witnesses. 2 of them, Daniel Davis and Ruth Ellen Shelton, had been shot to death. Multiple gunshot wounds from a .38 caliber pistol. The medical examiner would later determine they'd been shot in the head, neck, and shoulders. Execution style. Mark Flemons had been stabbed to death. A hunting knife had been plunged into his chest. The knife was still there, buried in his body, though the handle had broken off. It was a violent, personal way to kill someone. Jane Freet had died from severe head injuries. She had been bludgeoned, her skull fractured from repeated blows. The coroner would determine that she likely lived longer than the others, perhaps even after the initial attack, before finally succumbing to her injuries. All 4 were still wearing their burger chef uniforms, those distinctive orange and brown outfits that had been their work clothes. It was a small detail, but somehow it made the crime even more heartbreaking. They'd been wearing their uniforms. They'd been at work. They'd just been doing their jobs. The location where the bodies were found was significant. This wasn't a random spot. It was a carefully chosen location, remote and wooded, the kind of place where bodies might not be discovered for days or even weeks. The killers had known about this area, had either scouted it beforehand or were familiar enough with the rural roads of Johnson County to know where to go. The discovery of the bodies transformed what had been treated as a petty theft into one of the most shocking crimes in Indiana history. For young people murdered execution style, a small community shattered, families destroyed, and a crime that seemed almost inexplicable in its brutality. The investigation that followed was massive. Multiple law enforcement agencies combined their resources to form a task force dedicated solely to solving the burger chef murders. The Indiana State Police, Marion County Sheriff's Department, Speedway Police, and FBI all contributed personnel and resources. But from the very beginning, the investigation was hampered by a critical error. The crime scene at the Burger Chef restaurant had been compromised. After the bodies were discovered on Sunday, restaurant management made the decision to clean the facility and reopen it for business on Monday, less than 48 hours after the employees had disappeared. No crime scene preservation, no forensic analysis of the restaurant, No blood spatter analysis, no fingerprinting of surfaces, no detailed documentation of exactly how things had been left. The restaurant was wiped down, mopped, sanitized, and reopened. Any physical evidence that might have been present was destroyed. This decision to prioritize business over investigation would prove catastrophic. Modern forensic science might have been able to extract crucial evidence from that restaurant. DNA analysis, trace evidence, fingerprints, blood evidence, all of it potentially lost because someone decided it was more important to sell hamburgers than to preserve a crime scene. Investigators were left with precious little physical evidence. What they did have was this. Approximately $581 had been taken from the restaurant's safe. The back door had been left open. Jane Freet's car, a Chevrolet Vega, had been driven from the restaurant and abandoned near the Speedway Police Department. A strange detail that seemed almost like a taunt. And they had the bodies, along with the murder weapons still present at the scene, the .38 caliber bullets, the broken hunting knife. They also had one crucial witness. A 16-year-old boy had been at or near the Burger Chef around closing time on November 17th. He reported seeing two suspicious men in a car in the parking lot. Both men were white, appeared to be in their 30s. One man had a beard. The other was clean-shaven with light-colored, possibly blonde, hair. The two men had been sitting in their vehicle watching the restaurant. It was the kind of behavior that stands out, the kind of thing that makes you notice. Based on this witness description, police worked with forensic artists to create composite sketches of the two men. They even went further, creating three-dimensional clay busts of the suspects, detailed sculptures that could be displayed to the public and used to jog memories. These busts were distributed to police stations, shown on television, published in newspapers. Someone had to recognize these men. The investigation generated thousands of tips. The case received national media attention. Burger Chef Systems Incorporated, the corporation that owned the chain, posted a $25,000 reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction. In 1978, $25,000 was a substantial sum, equivalent to over $120,000 today. Yet despite the reward, despite the national attention, despite the composite sketches and the thousands of hours of police work, no arrests were made. Investigators pursued every lead, no matter how far-fetched. They looked into possible connections to other crimes in the area. In the months leading up to the Burger Chef murders, Speedway had been plagued by a series of bombings, homemade explosives being detonated around town. There had also been another murder in Speedway. A woman named Julia Cyphers had been killed. Was there a connection? Were these crimes related? Police investigated these possibilities exhaustively, but ultimately determined the crimes were unrelated. The Speedway bombings were eventually solved. They were the work of a man named Brett Kimberlin, who was convicted and sentenced to prison. Julia Cyphers' murder was also eventually solved, but neither case had any connection to the Burger Chef murders. Another theory that gained traction was the possibility of a fast food robbery gang, a group of criminals who specifically targeted restaurants, particularly during closing time when large amounts of cash would be present. In late 1978, just weeks after the Burger Chef murders, a man was overheard in a bar in Greenwood, Indiana, a town not far from Speedway, bragging that he had been involved in the killings. Police immediately tracked down this individual and brought him in for questioning. He was interrogated extensively and even subjected to a polygraph examination. He passed the polygraph, claiming he had not been involved in the murders. However, during questioning, he provided police with the names of other individuals, men he claimed were part of a crew that robbed fast food restaurants. Some of these men, he suggested, might have been involved in the Burger Chef case. Investigators followed these leads aggressively. One man they identified bore a striking resemblance to the bearded man from the composite sketches. When police tracked him down in Franklin, Indiana, and summoned him for a lineup, he did something that immediately raised suspicions. The night before the lineup, he shaved his beard, a beard he had worn for the previous 5 years. Why would someone shave off a distinctive feature right before being asked to appear in a lineup related to a crime where one suspect was described as having a beard? Despite the suspicious behavior, police didn't have enough evidence to charge him. They couldn't prove he'd been at the Burger Chef. They had no physical evidence linking him to the crime. Without a confession or direct evidence, their hands were tied. Another man named by the Greenwood bar informant matched the description of the fair-haired, clean-shaven man from the composite sketches. This individual also came to the attention of police for other reasons. He was later arrested and convicted for armed robberies of other fast food restaurants. The pattern of behavior matched. The profile matched. But again, there was no physical evidence connecting him to the Burger Chef murders specifically. A neighbor of the bearded suspect, someone who had never been identified by the original teenage witness, but whose name had been provided by the Greenwood informant, also ended up going to prison for armed robbery. So police had multiple individuals, all connected to each other, all with histories of robbing fast food restaurants, some matching the descriptions of the suspects. Yet they couldn't make a case stick. Years passed. The case grew colder. Families grieved. The community tried to heal. The Burger Chef restaurant remained open for a while, but eventually closed. The building sat empty for years, a haunting reminder of what had happened there. It would eventually house other businesses, including, ironically, a pawn shop. But to the people of Speedway, it would always be the Burger Chef, the place where 4 kids went to work and never came home. 6 years passed. The Burger Chef murders remained unsolved. The families of the victims had no answers, no closure, no justice. Police continued to receive tips occasionally, but none led anywhere substantial. The case was cooling, hardening into a cold case that might never be solved. Then, in November 1984, exactly 6 years after the murders, a phone call came into the Marion County Sheriff's Department that would reignite the investigation and give investigators hope that they might finally solve the case.